lovely war, the lovely war. Be a soldier, eh?
Hello and welcome to another episode of Oh, What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. With me is Jessica Meyer, Chris Kempshall, I'm Angus Wallace, and joining us today is Giles Penman. Giles is a postgraduate researcher at the University of Warwick, and in this episode we're going to be discussing the use of Greco-Roman imagery on cultural artefacts of the Great War. Giles, welcome. It's good to have you here. I wonder if you want to start by telling us about your research interests and how you got there.
Yes, certainly. Thank you. I study the use of Roman and ancient Greek imagery on the civic cultural artifacts of the First World War, specifically on medals, ceramics, and printed media. And such imagery includes wreaths, palm branches, figures of Britannia, who is a figure of Roman origin, and also temple structures. And I became interested in the use of Roman imagery during the First World War through my interest and research into military campaign medals. As an undergraduate student, I began to research and publish articles about the use of Roman and Greek imagery on First World War medals, in particular the Victory Medal, 1919, issued by the Allies, including Britain and the Empire. And as a result of the success of that writing in specialist journals, I began to think about future academic research in the subject, which would join together my interest in medals and my interest in classics. And so the research has developed from there, initially from looking at the gallantry medals of the Great War through memorials, and now to the defined subject that I have now been researching for a few years. I think I'm now at a point where I have my chapters all laid out, and I'm working through it with my supervisors. I
was reading one of your pieces on the Victory Medal. There was a lot in it that I'd never considered, but something that had occurred to me when I was reading through, there's an enormous amount of subtext when you start using classical imagery. I wonder how wide is this, beyond medals, and how wide is such imagery used to give people a sense of how popular it was? Or I'm not sure if that popular is the right phrase.
Certainly, ancient imagery permeates British public architecture and art and coins and medals for at least the previous centuries since the Renaissance. And what we know from the research of Elizabeth Vandiver, Edith Hall, and Henry Stead is that classical education and knowledge of classics by all sections of society was drawn from public architecture, formal schooling, and also from informal reading of English translations and compendia and condensations, particularly at the turn of the 20th century. And so this is something that all sections of British society would have understood and been able to relate to. And so it made sense for public imagery to take advantage of what Elizabeth Vandiver terms the mental furniture of British people. And so when it came to first imagining and giving messages about the First World War in wartime, particularly on recruiting posters, and then later afterwards in commemoration, it became a natural mode of expression.
Well, I was just wondering, you mentioned recruiting posters. I'm trying to think of one that uses explicit classical imagery, and I'm not sure that one's leaping to mind, but that's mainly because I've been using the ones of men in rolling countryside recently. So is there a well-known one that you would point to as emblematic of this?
Yes, so there is the Women Wanted Urgently poster, where Britannia is dressed in a stola with a crested helmet, standing in between auxiliary service women, standing shoulder to shoulder with them, encouraging women to serve in the auxiliary services in the latter part of the First World War.
Interesting that it's one recruiting women rather than men. I think we tend to assume that it's men who are being targeted by classical imagery for whatever reason, but it's good to have those assumptions challenged.
Sure, and certainly it is my contention with my current research that artists deployed Britannia on recruiting posters to encourage men and women to undertake particular gendered service. So for men, she encouraged them to undertake combatant service, particularly by imagining these servicemen exclusively holding rifles and bayonets, perhaps the emblematic image of the combatant. And she never appears alongside the many men who undertook non-combatant duties in supply and training and medical services. And then conversely, for women, she promotes the women in uniform in the supposedly new services of supply and logistics. Again, I contend, following Susan Grayzel, Deborah Tom, and Gail Braben, that actually these forms of female service were not new, but were rather forms of service that had long predated the Great War, but were nevertheless following in the same vein, and so were not nearly as controversial as they might first have appeared.
Is there a Britannia Remember Scarborough poster? I've got a real image of.
Yes, there is certainly, and that again forms a case study that I review in my current chapter. There Britannia is encouraging the young men of the town across all classes, since they are all dressed in perhaps stereotypical clothes of different classes, encouraging them to avenge Scarborough, but with a definite combatant edge. She thrusts a sword in the direction of the burning northeastern England town, very much in the stance of military exoration, thus clearly encouraging the young gentleman to undertake combatant service with weapons as opposed to undertaking logistics or supply.
What this partly makes me wonder is, because obviously we're already talking about recruitment posters, I can well imagine, certainly from what you're saying, that there's, this, I like the phrase kind of mental furniture in regards to the classics, reference points that everybody generally understands to varying degrees. But are there kind of peaks and troughs over time of how prevalent classical imagery is? Because I can well imagine it being very prevalent in propaganda and recruitment posters in 1914, and again on the medals post 1918 and 1919. And I know that Justin Fantauzzo and Robert L. Nelson have written about how kind of important classical imagery was to guys who were shipping out to Salonika and Greece and the like, it was something they got super into. And I'm pretty sure that Rupert Brooke writes about it before his death as well. But is there kind of like a moment and place element to when classical imagery kind of rises to the forefront, and then does it die down in 1916 and 1917 and then reappear in 1918? Or is there kind of a constant thread of it in the kind of the cultural landscape of the way that Britain is interacting with the war?
I think very much there is a constancy to it. I haven't noticed any sense in which it appears to disappear, particularly when we look at the broader scope to include post-war commemoration. It's very prevalent on the memorial plaque and on the Imperial War Graves Commission architecture. So it doesn't really die down, and perhaps, if anything, it increases in the post-war era. This is something I argue in my thesis, to present a particular view of the conflict in the early post-war period, trying to frame the conflict as a heroic endeavour undertaken by soldiers who were as brave and as militarily strong, if that makes sense, as courageous and heroic as their ancient antecedents, and also presenting Britain itself as a victorious nation more generally in the same vein, and in so doing dehistoricize the war, take it out of its immediate and horrific context and set it back into the past. But what that does as well is narrows the scope of interpretation of the conflict to a very particular defined set of ideas that doesn't take into account the broad scope of services which both men and women undertook during the conflict, both combatant and non-combatant, but also their enduring civilian identity, which is something that Helen McCarthy makes very clear in her book Citizen Soldiers, that these service personnel were first and foremost civilians whose identity endured throughout their service. And so casting them purely as soldiers does, in a sense, blind the post-war world in terms of material commemoration to the breadth of service and the true identity of Great War service personnel. And indeed also it narrows the scope of understanding about their deaths also. Death is not a topic that it directly references, but the idea is in commemoration. If all that is presented is the combatant, then there is the implication then that all service personnel who died were combatants who died a martial death in combat, whereas actually many died from accident and disease and non-battlefield injury, which simply isn't referenced in that kind of imagery. And by narrowing the scope, the importance of all of this is that then that affects cultural memory. It leads to a narrowing of what the public and British culture then remembers going further into the 20th century. And I think this has certainly influenced the way that modern Britons think about the First World War today.
So in terms of the classical imagery specifically, and of course there's an interesting overlap with the religious and particularly Anglican imagery that gets evoked in this light. But is it exclusively post-war? Is it exclusively about commemoration of the dead, or are there ways, and I'm thinking here in terms of fundraising for charities, for instance, that the imagery gets mobilized? Do you see sort of victory laurels or anything similar being evoked, or indeed any other way in which classical imagery is used for the sake of those who survive, as well as for that very dominant commemoration of the dead?
Sure, yes. And so on the King's Certificate of Discharge, two servicemen appear at a Greek temple structure with Britannia surrounded by an architectonic frame that is replete with bows and wreaths of victory. And neither of the men depicted show any sign of physical disability, despite the certificate being awarded to those who've been disabled by the conflict within British and Imperial forces. And so the prevalent notion there is that these men, in fighting and receiving their disablement, had fought bravely for Britain and for empire. And indeed, in terms of encouraging charity, Britannia appears prevalently there as well, particularly on posters to encourage charitable giving for the Belgians. And so she is taken on a non-martial aspect there, bending down to help a Belgian mother and her children, who have both appear to be have been ravaged by war. And in that way, she is encouraging other Britons to follow her example and help and give aid, whether physically and directly to Belgian people or through charitable donation. And she doesn't carry weapons there. She's very much more a mothering figure, bending down to assist the almost childlike Belgians, childlike in their innocence and their requirement for aid. Yeah.
You mentioned before this idea of the citizen soldier, and I guess you can link that with the classical world, where classical military it's been as sort of the Greek Athenians come out. To make perhaps a leap, is there a transnational use of this imagery? Because you got me thinking there about the idea of French citizen soldiers, coming out to serve the country. Is it a transnational movement using classical imagery?
I would definitely say so, yes. Whilst it's beyond the scope of my current research, I know that there is a definite use of ancient imagery within French recruiting posters. The Marianne is a very prominent figure, again dressed in classicizing stola, palla and stola. encouraging French service personnel onwards towards victory. And in a similar vein, there is also heavy use of classical imagery in Italian certificates and other recruiting posters. So this is certainly something that would bear further research. And indeed, it is apparent to me that imperialism is a big theme here across. Having written the three chapters as I have, it's now other ideas have sprung up, and it's quite clear that imperialism is a distinct theme, and the a national imagining what it is to be French or Italian or British, and what that means in the context of war, and certainly coming to the aid of your nation patriotically is a big part of what is being encouraged on the part of citizens. But in terms of how the nation conceives of itself, it appears that there is this constant reference to Europe's last great empire, the Roman Empire, as a distinct reference. And this is something that I'm now working on as part of a chapter rewrite. And so I've been thinking about the way in which Britannia is and other provinces are viewed on Roman coins, to try and bring back the classical to my research.
In terms of the reference to Italy, at this point we should probably give a shout out to former interviewee on this podcast, Vanda Wilcox, because her recent book has the most amazing cover of I think it's a recruitment poster that is very, very much drawing on that classical imagery and that woman in the stola that you're referring to. I think it's a beautiful illustration of exactly the point you're making.
And certainly there is a wonderful scope for transnational research. And I think particularly that transnational research should focus on conceptions of nationalism and conceptions of nationhood, and what it means both to be a nation, but also what it means to serve a nation, and how one breaks that down in terms of what are the implications for the service personnel, individually and collectively, to serve the nation using classical imagery. And I think this is something now that I've been asked to rewrite a chapter, that I've now come to appreciate with more clarity.
With the kind of the importance of, as you're saying, of kind of rising importance of empire and nationalism, there's also an element here of, it's not just kind of empire as defined by size or strength of arms, it's empire of the mind, really, isn't it? Because when you're talking about classicism of Rome or Greece or things like that, you're talking about concepts of science and democracy, and it's about as much about kind of in the First World War period of German culture versus French civilisation. There's a national identity of reasonableness, of ours is the reasonable, enlightened way of life. That's why we get to hark back to Rome. That's why we get to hark back to Greece. And their way of life is just rubbish and barbaric. And
because there's a very direct evocation in calling Germans the Hun, that these are the Hun and the Vandals who sacked Rome. It's quite specific in some ways.
And certainly Elizabeth Van Diver makes this point very clear in her book, Stand in the Trench Achilles, that classicism was used to represent, as you say, Chris, civilization and its civic avocations, as well as sort of civic attributes, as well as its military ones. The way in which the nations view themselves at this time is very much directed towards that dichotomy between, as you say, just the Hun and civilization, drawing that dichotomy clearly in order to advance the necessity for joining in the conflict. But what is intriguing also is that German imaginings of the war themselves sort of go the other way. That they don't draw so much on classicism, but rather more the romantic ideals of medievalism. This is something that Stefan Gobel makes very clear in his work, centering on the commemoration of the war in Britain and Germany, using using medievalism both during and after the conflict. And it is that preponderance of medievalism in Germany that I believe is drawing on similar ideals. Both are dehistoricizing the conflict and drawing it back to a mythical past in order to present the conflict in a particular way, to present it with chivalric ideals, which perhaps parallel the ideals of the Roman legionary.
It's interesting drawing it back to what could also be seen as problems that Rome had on the German border as well, isn't it? If the Allies are happily putting themselves with the Romans, the Germans are planting themselves somewhere else in their history.
But what is intriguing as well is that classicism isn't used in set fixed ways. It's the same allusions are used for very different purposes. And again, Elizabeth van der Werf makes this point very clearly in her work looking at the First World War poetry. I don't necessarily see the same polyvalence with the figure of Britannia. I think that Britannia is perhaps used in a more defined way to promote recruiting and changes to social behaviour, whether that be reducing bread consumption or alcohol consumption or giving to charity. But she's not used in a negative way ever, unlike in poetry where Caesar can be both representative of France and Britain and the Allies, as well as being representative of Germany and the Kaiser through clear verbal allusion across time. For me, there are transnational differences and perhaps differences across media with the use of Roman and Greek imagery, but certainly in terms of the propagation of national ideals, there's a sense of being fixed, and maybe being fixed is an attribute in itself, indicating a sense of stability amid a time of turmoil. That whatever else is going on, Britain is the same as she ever was, and strong, and both militarily and civilly.
Just picking up on that idea of the importance of this imagery to the concept of empire, which I'm very convinced by. Have you looked at any sort of American representations? Because, of course, you have a lot of classical architecture in the US, but at the same time, and particularly in this period, the US is profoundly anti-imperialist in its self-representation, even if not in its actions. So I'm just wondering, does classical imagery turn up in any of the American cultural output that you're aware of?
Yes, I think that there is a strong link between certainly once America joins the war in 1917 in a more active capacity. There is certainly a classical connection between Liberty and Britannia. I've certainly seen Punch cartoons which depict Britannia and Liberty together in classical garb. I think drawing on similar ideals of the support for liberty and peace and freedom, but I don't think that there's any sense in which they're anti-imperial in the context of Britain. I think it would not fit the scheme of representation that I see to be prevalent.
I was going to say, I suspect that I could well imagine British publications like Punch drawing a link between Britannia and Liberty. My feeling, having looked at a reasonable amount of America stuff, that is not going to be reflected back in the other direction. I think it's going to be far more about Liberty and Marianne than as kind of shared Republican ideals than chaining themselves to a British idea of classical culture, which I don't think the Americans are going to have a lot of time for.
I think that's very much likely to be the case, given the close association between France and the United States during the conflict. I think politically and militarily there was always a closer relationship between the US and France than the US and the British Empire. I think, as you say rightly, for because of the shared Republican ideals. But I think certainly when trying to promote a sense of a shared cause, perhaps, but both the US and Britain compromised in its visual imagery to show that togetherness by placing victory and liberty together. But certainly it's an intriguing. The transnational perspective is of classicism and imperialism in this period is certainly a fascinating avenue for pursuit, whether as an additional chapter to my thesis or afterwards.
Sounds like a potential postdoc.
Yes, I think so. Yes, certainly it's would be a fascinating expansion on my thesis. Yes,
I mean, so in a number of countries on the victory medal use the same symbolism of is it Victoria? I wonder if they fit if there's subtle changes to the image that fit with perceived national characteristics on all the medals. So you've got the same person represented, but it's different. Does that happen? And what are people perceiving the differences that they need to add? The
figure of victory was shared across the Allies, but as you rightly say, yes, used very differently. And I think there is certainly something there about the projection of particular messages about nationhood and victory, which didn't necessarily fit with the reality. And one glaring example is the Italian victory medal, which depicts victory on a chariot being drawn by two lions. This has a classical antecedent in mosaics of I believe that the 4th century. There was a particular North African mosaic depicting victory on a chariot being led by lions. But what is intriguing is that image does not fit the history of the Italian participation in the Great War. Italy lost the first 12 battles of the Isonzo Valley and had to be rescued by a joint Allied contingent later in the war at the Battle of Caporetto. And then in subsequent treaties only gained small areas of territory, small areas of northern territory. So, which was not by any measure a suitable recompense for the loss that Italy suffered in terms of men and material in the conflict. So, in a sense, this is very much the image on the victory medal is a projection of of how Italy wished to be perceived as a victor at the end of the conflict, rather than an accurate assessment of their performance.
I haven't checked with Vandra for a while. It's entirely possible they're still going on the Isonzo. So they approached the 329th Battle of the Isonzo Valley, 100 years after the conflict ended.
And certainly that same perception is repeated across the printed media, so the certificates, which can be accessed through Europeana. A great resource, by the way, just a shout out for Europeana. And also repeated on the war memorials, the Italian war memorials for the conflict as well. The sort of same sense of almost Roman-like triumph that the Italians, if one is to believe the memorials and the medal, the Italians had achieved a great victory against the enemies of the Kingdom of Italy, whereas in reality that simply was not the case.
Can I take us back to something you mentioned a while ago now, right at the start? This idea that this use of classical imagery has really shaped our current perception of the war, and the extent, I'm wondering about the extent to which classicism is still part of our memory and commemorations. And I'm saying this because, so we're recording this just after Remembrance Sunday, and the Remembrance Sunday service that I go to always uses the Kohima epitaph, which, okay, that's Second World War rather than First World War, but it is very much harking back to Greek traditions, to Simonides, and it is quite clearly part of how war and war service and war sacrifice is commemorated within the Anglican Church in this case. So I'm just wondering, is that representative? Is that Halifax Minster being weird? Or is this use of classical imagery within what is perceived as traditional commemorative practice really, really evident? And are people aware of that today?
I would say that there is a dualism to modern commemoration, that on the one hand, what people most remember, particularly in Britain, of the Great War is the mud, blood and death of Flanders, the that men were soldiers, the privileging of the front line experience, and women were nurses. And on the other hand, the idea of heroism, that those who served and those that died were heroes. And I think that very much conforms to what the ancient imagery was trying to project about the war, both during and after the conflict. So I think that whilst the public may not now be able to accurately interpret the ancient imagery as their Great War forebears may have done, due to the decreased availability of classical education within the British school system, the idea of classical heroism is certainly prevalent in the way that remembrance services describe.
I'm just trying to think back to, and it tells you how long it's been since, shamefully, I've read Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, but the extent to which Lutyens went out to explain the meaning of the cenotaph as the empty tomb, and whether the extent to which that is just an assumed knowledge, I can't remember, because I think Jay goes into that in some detail in that book.
I'm quite fascinated to think what my grandfather would make of classics if it, when he left school at 14 to become a farm labourer. How much he had drilled into him, or were they just reading classical text without them just to practice reading, or
My understanding is that there would have been a variety of classical knowledge across the class system. So certainly all classes would have had some appreciation of ancient imagery, but not everybody would have had the same appreciation. And even those who undertook classical education at school would not have had the same memory, the same knowledge of the ancient world. Not everybody was interested in the classics. Not everybody had aptitude for it, or indeed the interest for it. And so there would naturally have been a sliding scale of knowledge and appreciation. And so certainly when Lutyens comes out and describes the cenotaph, it is for that reason, that not everybody would have been able to accurately interpret that image, and so would have needed help to be able to do that. And so when I say everybody would have had knowledge of the classics, we don't mean to say that they had the same appreciation. And that's worth remembering when considering classical reception. There's even been research undertaken around the classical world that made it clear that not everybody across the classical world had the same understanding of their own cultural images at the time that they were produced. So it then stands to reason that many centuries later, not everybody's going to have the same appreciation of the received image either.
I mean, presumably most would have had at least some exposure to the idea that the Romans invaded Britain. And I'm just thinking of the various bits of children's literature that I've encountered this in. But, Kipling's Puck of Pook's Hill has a whole chapter on a Roman legionary at Hadrian's Wall. So I think it's dominant enough in sort of public education that Sellers and Yeatman include the Roman invasion in their pastiche in 1066 and all that, in at least some of the jokes, if not actually in the chronology. So I think an awareness in popular culture coming out of sort of general education, perhaps. But I wouldn't say. I'm wondering about imagery rather than sort of a sense that the Romans were in Britain at some point.
Yes, I think. I think again there are cultural references which still pervade education today. I think I certainly know from the outreach work I've done with schools that there is certainly a continuing interest in the ancient world, in the Romans, and I tried very hard to include as many images of Roman legionaries and soldiers as I could in the presentations I gave on that subject. And I tried to make it as visual as possible, not only to be engaging, but to try and show what the ancient world looked like, or was imagined to have looked like. Assessing understanding is always very difficult, and so trying to assess how ancient imagery would have been received at the end of, during, and at the end of the Great War is really quite tricky. I rely on newspaper evidence for that, and the newspaper evidence is fleeting, but it's there, and there's clearly an appreciation of what the ancient imagery was intended to do. even if there isn't direct comment. And so to cite an example, many in Britain saw the memorial plaque and the use of Britannia's image there to be a worthy tribute to their relatives that died. Others were also greatly saddened by receiving their memorial plaque, including one woman who committed suicide upon receiving her son's memorial plaque. And then in the colonies and dominions within empire, there was a great attraction to the memorial plaque as a sign of gratitude from the empire and from the civic and military authorities, who actually in Australia handed them out to relatives. And it was widely reported that the image of Britannia was seen as an image of empire. So very much in the context of a sense of imperial power from the periphery to the centre, as a means of the centre acknowledging its own power within a wider international imperial framework. I think that follows closely the way in which Britannia was used on Roman coins, particularly from the 3rd century onwards, which depicted the emperor very much more closely engaging with the image of Britannia, showing the relationship of the central imperial authority to the more local province in a positivist way that reflected its significant place within the overall scheme. But here we kind of see it in the modern world the other way around, the sense of Britannia being the significant figure and Britannia praising and lauding the efforts of her colonial subjects. So it's an interesting volte-face.
Talk about imagery directly. How close are these to original depictions, or are they sort of simulacra of artifacts?
Trying to find direct antecedents for ancient imagery is, unless they specifically copy a coin image or a piece of artwork, it's very difficult to find exact sources. So perhaps a simulacra would be a better term, because there's no mimetic copying. The image itself adapts over time. So the imagery first appears on British coins during the late 17th century on the coins of Charles II, specifically copying coins of Hadrian, showing Britannia in a seated position. She only then gains her trident, not from the ancient world, but from during the 18th century in the context of naval victory. And so the image of Britannia that is received during the Great War is not the same image that was used in the ancient world, and indeed the imagery that's used in the ancient world develops as well. So the imagery that is used during the Great War is a combination, a palimpsest in a way, of this great development over thousands of years, which makes it, as I'm sure you can imagine quite challenging to interpret as a classicist and as a historian. I see this imagery through bifocal lenses.
I made a note about the transnational perspective. When people like the British Empire are handing out medals, the non-Western European, the non-European people of the Empire fighting, such as Africans or Indians, will all be getting presumably classical symbolism, which means absolutely nothing to them culturally, other than what the British have basically stamped on the things.
It has been made clear in work of cultural reception particularly by Fantauzzo Vesunia, that those who were educated in the classics did understand Latin and Greek and did learn it at school in India, and so they would have been they interpreted the imagery. But then on the other end of the scale, the illiterate parents of the deceased sepoy had no idea what this imagery meant. They had no cultural references to use, because they came from a very different cultural milieu, whether that be Hindu or Sikh or Muslim. They didn't have the cultural references that British people did to interpret them. And indeed, I know from an expert in the field, Professor Edward Haynes, formerly of Duke University in America, specialist in Indian studies, that the memorial plaques were not even handed to many of these village families, but were instead kept at the barracks and used as coasters.
Yeah, I'm not even surprised.
But what this does mean is that there are then no sources as to how they interpreted them, because they didn't have opportunity. All I can really say for certain is that they didn't understand. I can't speak for certain as to what they made of it, but I do understand from Professor Haynes that on the Victory Medal, many of the surviving servicemen believed that the figure was not Victoria, but rather Victoria the goddess, but rather Victoria the Queen. Again, a cultural misunderstanding, but one can appreciate how they arrived at that ascription, given the major role of Queen Victoria into bringing India into the British Empire.
Empress of India, no less.
Indeed so, yes. Empress of India, indeed. And in that way, Victoria is viewed and is depicted and remembered very much in the vein of Roma in her numismatic iconography, and then also in the memorials to her after her death. I'm thinking particularly of the Victoria Memorial on Pall Mall, which depicts Victoria as Victoria the Goddess, alongside many other classical depictions, setting Victoria and her victories in that ancient context, but also focusing on those military victories through the Victoria figure.
I just have pictures now of Queen Victoria sort of depicted on the Victory Medal as sort of some short, dumpy woman.
The Widow of Windsor is Kipling again, had it?
Yeah, doesn't quite scan as well, does it? As
there was an interesting conflation in a cartoon which encouraged Britons to eat less bread by casting Britannia in the guise of Queen Victoria, actually wearing her shawl and her mourning clothes, whilst in a sitting room, whilst in a kitchen, barring the door to the postman, who was depicted as an emaciated man, clearly in the throes of famine, conflating the two as a means of, I believe, boosting the authoritative nature of the figure. Britannia was the spirit of the nation, and indeed Victoria, Empress of India, Queen of the British Empire, Empress in a sense, had only recently died and was therefore within recent cultural memory. And by conflating these two figures together, they're trying to present the idea that this woman is to be obeyed and not to be overruled by anyone at all, for she is the mightiest of women.
Presumably that, as with many of the posters, went through some kind of board discussion meeting, and instead of at the end of that meeting everyone going, it's a bit weird, isn't it, really? Is this going to be a poster? Everyone, genius, fantastic, print 100 of them. Everyone's going to understand the metaphor behind this.
But actually that has in common with the all the action of Wellington House. The posters were drawn up by private illustrators of publishing companies, and Wellington House simply acquiesced to all of them, actually. I believe. I don't think there was any news of rejections.
There's the most bizarre Spanish flu public health poster doing the rounds on Twitter at the moment, where the flu is personified as this. It looks like Gollum, actually. You're just thinking, who thought of that, and how did it ever get approved? I mean, we use propaganda posters a lot, right, as cultural historians of the war. Some of them are really bizarre.
I have very much a feeling of, would I have understood this at the time? Is it just that because I'm 100 years afterwards now, this is like a reference point or a discussion point that existed in society at the time that I'm just not getting? Or was it really weird then and it has become no less weird through the passage of time?
But it's trying to get at cultural appreciation is really difficult, and it's frustrating because it would be so fascinating if one could go back and get into Doctor Who's TARDIS and go back and ask everyone. It would be really useful. My research would be so much better, so much richer for it.
This is true of all of us, I suspect.
Well, if you're going, we'll give you a list of questions.
And some suggestions to invest some money in for forthcoming technology in stock, just so you can come back as a very well-rounded researcher and a millionaire.
It's asking then the question, how did Britons receive classical imagery, which I think is the most difficult question. But I think really the answer that I've formulated over my 3 chapters that I've written so far is that as many Britons as lived at the time, there are probably as many opinions or misconceptions, confusion, or simply apathy about the imagery. So all I can do really is, I imagine, in concert with all cultural historians, including those on this podcast, is to try to piece together what evidence exists and come up with appropriate conclusions about how imagery was received.
Well, I've had to do similar at times, looking at bits and pieces that come out in interwar years, reflecting like detective novels or short stories and stuff, reflecting back on the kind of the Anglo-French Entente. And the closest kind of rule of thumb I've been able to build for it is the very existence of this thing must show that it was not outlandish. By existing, there must have been some form of audience who would understand what it was referring to and the terms that it was using. But beyond that, as you say, take half a dozen people, you're going to end up with at least half a dozen different interactions with it.
I think there's a slight difference in terms, and I say this as someone else who's used detective fiction to do this sort of thing with slightly different questions. But, I think there may, that point about Wellington House passing just every random poster that came across its desk versus particularly genre material, so films or popular literature. When we talk about this podcast being about the intersection of the First World War and popular culture, it started with the things that we knew were consumed and that people paid money for, essentially. And what's interesting, Giles, about your work is that you're talking about cultural artifacts which are widely circulated, but not necessarily because people want to consume them. So our ability to say, oh yes, people understood and appreciated what this imagery meant is much more difficult with the sort of imagery you're talking about, because it's being circulated enormously, out to India, even if it never gets beyond the barracks, but not necessarily because that's what people want to consume to represent their understanding.
No, that is very true. I think, as we know from recent research undertaken in Scotland about and showcased at the International Society for First World War Studies conference, is that the publishing houses were very much able to be a litmus test for what people wanted, consumerism and consumer culture, because they wouldn't publish what was not popular and what people didn't want. They were playing to an audience. Whereas you're right, that isn't the same for recruiting posters and medals and others, which don't play to consumerism, but rather to more official forms of messaging or commemoration. But I do feel that such imagery wouldn't have been used if it couldn't be understood or didn't conform to some form of public feeling. And I think this is very, very true of the way the printed media and the medals and the ceramics conceive of the serviceman and his service. There was a definite public movement towards considering these men as heroes, particularly within a Christian context. And Suzanne Evans has conducted research on this and made it clear from a Canadian perspective that there was a large spectrum of opinion which considered soldiers to be in this way. And so when set into the context of commemoration, we also see this as well. The Imperial War Graves Commission, in its use of stripped back classicism, to use Anna Carden-Coyne's phrase, attempts to promote this idea of the servicemen as heroes.
I'm just trying to remember Alex King's book on the war memorial, the various local war memorial committees. And it would be interesting to go back to that and look at the number that did go for classical imagery at a local level, because there you are talking not about sort of the educated Oxbridge of Whitehall, the establishment, but you are talking very much about local government, some of whom would have been classically educated, absolutely, but not necessarily everyone on the committee. So it'd be interesting to look at those local memorials as well, rather than something as centralized as the Imperial War Graves Commission.
Yes, and this is something that I looked at in the earlier part of my research, but then after I read Anna Carden-Coyne's work, it became clear to me that in terms of doctoral work, I wouldn't be able to add anything to her brilliant chapter on monumental classicism in terms of the ideas she put forward. But from in that early phase of my research, when I read Alex King's work on the local memorials, I did some analysis on using the Imperial War Museum's Graves War Memorials Register. I conducted an analysis of classicism versus other genres, and it appeared that whilst there was a heavy use of classicism on Boer War and Second World War memorials, there was a much greater spike in those which were classical during the First World War. So there is a very great preponderance of classicism in commemoration during the early interwar period, suggestive of a classical boom, to borrow J. Winter's phrases about periods of memory. But I think it's difficult to be able to assess specific classical knowledge. I think all we can say is that those who commissioned and paid for the memorials felt that classicism was the mode through which they could express their ideas about the war. But what I find intriguing is the unity across all media, that different artists in different media had the potential of using classicism in so many different ways, and yet they chose to show remarkable unity of thought about how to represent Britannia and in what way to represent her, and how classical imagery could be used to promote ideas of heroism on the part of the servicemen. So I think that there must surely then be a sense in which the education of the British elite and artists allowed them to formulate similar ideas.
Particularly as you've now got to presumably go and make a little classical figure out of Lego.
I'm sure Lego must have a cenotaph somewhere. Please tell me Lego has a Lego cenotaph.
There's a whole Lego, the gap in the market, Lego war memorials and Lego.
I'm pretty sure I've seen it. There are people who've done Lego models of cenotaphs out of their own stuff. I'm wondering if I've seen like a mock layout of London.
There's one at the Auckland War Memorial. No, that's the online cenotaph. Never mind. Ignore me. There's something calling itself a Lego cenotaph that's actually a Commonwealth war grave or Commonwealth cemetery. Right, I'm going to set this as a challenge to my son to build me a cenotaph.
Yes, I was going to say, Jessica, if your son is successful, please do send me an image. I'd be wonderful to see that.
Is it going to be a historically accurate one where he makes it out of wood and papier-mâché first, and then a year later turns it into Lego?
What a great idea. So, Chris, as our diary secretary, what are we looking at next?
Well, obviously, Angus, now that we are in, presumably, January 2022, as I look ahead to February, I think we're going to do graphic novels, I get the feeling, because as we're in January 2022, you have received as Christmas presents to yourself any number of editions of Charlie's War, and presumably the rest have as well? Question mark.
I'm not sure about Charlie's War, but I will certainly be going out and looking for Tardy with a certain amount of nervousness, I must say.
It's a read. I was saying to Angus before we started recording, it is fantastic. There is a different tone to it to Charlie's War.
Yeah, I will be gifting myself Charlie's War to use that awful term, but
and of course we can talk about this in the past tense because we've already done all of
oh
this,
yes.
having already had Christmas, and it was lovely.
Well, Giles, thank you. That was fantastic. I enjoyed that very much. And Chris, Jessica, until next time, bye for now.
See you soon.
Thank you. Thank
Happy
you.
New Year, everybody.
Bye. Yeah.
Oh, it's a lovely war. Oh, we once with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Come fast, Richard, how can we spend the Oblivion? Oh, it's a lovely war.